Hey, everyone. Thank you so much for coming tonight. I'm really delighted that you're here with me as we greet my friend, Lauren Belfer, and Laura Glista is also my friend, so it's a lucky night for me. My name is Mary Kozub, and I'm the Director of Education here at the Birchfield Penny Arts Center. I want to just start before we get into the wonderful book that I'm sure many of you have already read, and if you haven't, I advise you to read it. I want to just share a little bit about our book club, which began in 2011 as a docent initiative. It was started by a docent who's no longer with us, Jane Roubaix. We started by reading the books that Charles Birchfield read, including Winesburg, Ohio, Alice in Wonderland, Thoreau, and any number of other books. And then we made a quick pivot to reading books written by regional authors, which is completely in keeping with the mission of the Birchfield Penny Arts Center to support the incredible talents of the people within our own community. And so that's how we were born. And since that day, we have welcomed over 90 authors, to the center. And this is Lauren's second visit, and we're just absolutely delighted that she was able to come and be here with us this evening. Before we begin, I'm going to ask that you shut down your cell phones, turn off those phones, and be mindful of the exits in case of an emergency. There are two behind you and one to your right, my left, behind me. So, are we all set? Please greet Laura Glista, who is also docent here at the Birchfield Penny Arts Center, who has graciously agreed to facilitate tonight's talk. So thank you, Laura.
Thank you. This is an honor to be a part of this. Lauren Belfer grew up in Buffalo, New York. Her debut novel, City of Light, was a New York Times bestseller, as well as a New York Times notable book, a Library Journal Best Book, and a main selection of the Book of the Month Club. Her second novel, A Fierce Radiance, was named a Washington Post Best Novel and an NPR Best Mystery. Her third novel, And After the Fire, received the National Jewish Book Award. Ashton Hall, her fourth novel, was published in June of 2022 and was recognized by the New York Times Book Review. Booklist called it exquisitely illuminated. Lauren lives in New York City. It is no surprise that she can so masterfully weave together stories and historical information in each novel with her mom, Nancy Belfer, as a well-known fiber artist. Please join me in a warm Birchfield Penny welcome for Lauren Belfer.
Well, thank you all of you so much for being here. It's such an honor to speak at the Birchfield. This is such a community center. I really love coming here, and everyone is always so warm. The exhibitions are always fascinating. So it's really touching then to be asked to give a presentation myself here. I want to give a special thanks to Mary Kozub for all she's done to create this event, and also to thank her for her friendship to me and to my mother across years and years, decades, really. Thank you to Laura Glista. And I just found out that Laura took 3, or was it 4? 4 courses with my mom over at Buff State. I mean, if you don't know of Nancy Belfer, she taught for many, many years just across the street there at Upton Hall. So it's just wonderful to come here and meet one of her former students. We've just come from dinner with my mom, so she's doing really well. A special thanks to Dee Dee Santana, who's up in the tech booth. Dee Dee performed miracles tonight so that all I had to do was walk in that room and sit down on this chair. And it's not always that way, let me tell you. Sometimes it's very hard to get the PowerPoint working. So I'm really grateful to Dee Dee. And special thanks too to Michaela Warosh for handling the reservations and now for handling the webinar. So apparently there's quite a big crowd watching this virtually, and thank you all for doing that. And of course, I want to give a special thanks to all of you, the audience, because this talk is part of the Birchfield Penny Book Club, and there wouldn't be a book club, and there wouldn't even be books if there weren't readers. So thank you all for being readers and for caring enough about books to join book clubs and to come out to this event tonight. So Ashton Hall is a novel that weaves together many things, but it begins when an almost 40-year-old American woman named Hannah Larson goes to England with her 9-year-old son, Nicky. And they go there to care for an ill relative who rents an apartment in a stately home, the Ashton Hall of the title. Nicky is neurodivergent and sees the world differently from others, and Hannah has given up her career to care for him. Soon after they arrive, Nicky goes exploring in a deserted wing of the house and discovers a secret from the past, a secret that he and his mother unravel through the course of the novel, while at the same time creating new lives for themselves in England. Now, as Laura said, this is my 4th novel, and here are the covers of the previous 3. City of Light, which takes place right here, of course, and I always feel so moved when I remember the research that I did here over 20 years ago now, walking up and down the Olmsted Parkways, inviting myself into the old houses, which I really actually did. I would stand outside and wait for someone to come out to walk their dog and then ask if I could see their house. And people in Buffalo are so nice. They would just say, "Oh, sure, you want to see the house? Come in." Maybe I just looked really innocent, but I can't imagine that happening anywhere else. A Fierce Radiance is set in New York City during World War II, and after the fire follows the fate of a fictional masterpiece by Johann Sebastian Bach through 250 years of history. But although Ashton Hall is the most recent of my novels, it's also the one that was percolating through my mind the longest. I first had the idea for Ashton Hall when I was in my early 20s, and I was invited to stay here at Blickling Hall, a National Trust historic mansion in Norfolk, England. So remarkably, an acquaintance of mine was actually renting an apartment at Blickling Hall, and come to find out, many stately homes rent out private apartments. I was a committed Anglophile then, and I dreamed of living in England. I can pinpoint the exact moment when my obsession with Britain began. It began here, at the North Park branch of the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library. This story proves that a book and a library can change your life, because one day at the North Park branch of the library, when I was about 11 years old, my mother handed me a copy of this book, Catherine by Anna Seton. Now, Catherine is a very long book. This edition has 393 pages with very small print. I've teased my mother that when she gave it to me, she was hoping it would keep me busy for a few weeks at least. And it did keep me busy because it sparked in me a passionate interest in English history, which consumed me for years. This book is about a remarkable woman named Catherine Swynford, who lived in the 14th century. Now, if you've never read this novel, I really encourage you to look for it as soon as you finished reading Ashton Hall. Now, by reading Catherine, I first learned about women called anchoresses. These were women in the Middle Ages who chose to be walled off from the world in cells called anchor holds, which were usually next to churches. They did this so that they could devote themselves to prayer. They often gave advice to people who would gather at the window of their anchor cells, and sometimes they taught children to read. Sometimes they also became religious mystics. Now, this picture shows a bishop blessing a woman who has decided to become an anchoress, rather. And because I learned about anchoresses at a relatively early age, I'd always assumed that they were commonly known about, particularly among Catholics. But I've learned during my book tour for Ashton Hall that in fact, very few people have ever even heard of anchorisses, which is why I'm taking a moment to talk about them. Anchorisses play a role in Ashton Hall. So when I was in my 20s and received the invitation to visit Blickling, I was thrilled. Blickling was constructed in the early 1600s on the site of homes dating back to the 11th century. Legend holds that Anne Boleyn was born in a house on this site. During my stay at Blickling, I toured the gorgeous gardens, which include a drained moat. I spotted the croquet court, which I was to incorporate in the novel years later. I explored the magnificent public rooms, especially the library, and noticed the beautifully carved ceiling. And I also explored the private areas of the house, the back hallways and the attics, which were accessible to me after visiting hours. As I made my way through the rambling shadowed corridors and the old nurseries and the storage rooms, ideas came into my mind for a novel, and I jotted down some notes, but I didn't begin writing. I think I was too young and inexperienced to write the novel then. After my stay at Blickling, I went on to get married and become a mother, and also to work in a variety of jobs. I worked as a paralegal at law firms, as a researcher for TV news, as a fact checker at magazines. And I had a long road to success as a writer. My first short story to be published was rejected 42 times before it found an editor who loved it. That editor apparently hadn't checked in with the other editors who had already rejected it. The second short story of mine to be published was much more successful. It was rejected only 27 times. So one day, years and years after my stay at Blickling, and after I'd published 2 novels and was completing a third, and my son was grown up, something surprising happened. One day, my husband received an email inviting him to be a visiting fellow at an institute affiliated with Cambridge University. This is St. John's College at Cambridge University. When Michael told me about the email, he said, "Well, that's very flattering, but it really doesn't interest me." And I said, "Now wait just 1 minute." And before you know it, we were packing our bags and moving to England. The Institute provided us with accommodation at this green cottage, which was built in 1642. Now, when I first heard about it, I thought, 1642, how romantic. But when we got there, the cottage turned out to be drafty, ramshackle, and pretty much sinking into the ground. The plumbing was unusual. All of the water in the house, except for the toilet, all the other water flowed out of the house through a green hose in the wall and into a cesspool in the side alley. Now, this cesspool required stirring every day. The landlady informed me that it was my job as the woman of the house to do the daily stirring, and a large stick was provided for this task. Now, when in the fullness of time, the cold of winter arrived, I asked the landlady what to do in case the cesspool froze over. And with great condescension in her voice, she said, "Why, everyone knows that you just boil a kettle of water in the morning and pour it into the cesspool, and you will have no problems with it in the winter." And that is what I did. I boiled a kettle every morning and poured that water into the cesspool. Later, Michael and I learned that the English call this type of plumbing arrangement a French drain. Now, that's a really remarkable phrase because it simultaneously denigrates the French and elevates the drain. It's a French drain. So I just love that name for it. I was also shocked to discover upon our arrival in Cambridge that cows were wandering freely on much of the parkland. And this was especially shocking because we had to walk across the parks or commons as they're called in England, to reach the center of town, to reach the university. Now, here are the cows of Stourbridge Common, which is just across the river from our cottage. I had to walk past these cows every day. And here are the cows of Midsummer Common. The grazing rights for these cows goes back to the Middle Ages. And I tell you, I wasn't prepared for walking through cow fields when I arrived in Cambridge, and I didn't really care for it. You know, you don't really see cows in Greenwich Village in New York, where I live now. And I never saw any cows on Bidwell Parkway when I was growing up in Buffalo. So it was quite a shock to me. But Cambridge was so beautiful that I tried to put this inconvenience aside. Here's a photo of the River Cam right near our cottage. These are the Grantchester Meadows, where the writer Virginia Woolf is said to have gone skinny dipping with the poet Rupert Brooke before the First World War. Here are the inner gates of Trinity College. And this is King's College. Now, one day, as I was wandering the narrow historic streets of Cambridge, half in a dream as I contemplated ideas for my next novel, suddenly in a moment of insight, I knew what the novel would be. I'd rename and fictionalize Blickling Hall. I'd move it to the outskirts of Cambridge, and I'd set my story there. I'd blend in everything I'd learned about the actual experience of living in England, as distinct from the fantasies I'd had, and I'd include the cows and the French drain and more. The main characters came to me in a flash, people that I cared about deeply, especially Hannah, struggling to puzzle out her future after a devastating discovery, and her beloved son, Nicky. One of the themes I wanted to explore was the special challenge of raising neurodiverse children. The first thing I had to do as I began the novel was to create the fictional Ashton Hall, one that would be responsive to everything that my plot needed from it. So to do this, I researched and combined several stately homes. This is Mattingley Hall outside Cambridge. I wove in features of Mattingley Hall as I created Ashton Hall, especially the row of lime trees leading to the entryway. These are the gardens at Mattingley. I also visited Audley End, not too far from Cambridge, and I took some of the monumentality of Audley End and gave it to my fictional Ashton Hall. This is an older house, Baddesley Clinton, and notice the half-timbered second story. And I used this too as I created the fictional Ashton Hall. And this is Burleigh House, one of the greatest houses of the Elizabethan era, built and still owned by the Cecil family in England. And I like to imagine Ashton Hall bathed in sunlight that way at sunset. And I explored many other homes, and I took a window from one and a tower from another, a doorway from a third, until I had conjured up the fictional Ashton Hall of my imagination. I decided I wanted the novel to explore the religious persecutions which took place in England during the Tudor era, when the nation's rulers forcibly shifted the country from Catholic to Protestant, and then from Protestant to Catholic, and then back to Protestant once more. I set this part of the story at Oxborough Hall, about an hour from Cambridge. Oxborough has a so-called priest hole, a concealed room where priests would hide during the Elizabethan era when government troops came to the house to search for them, to arrest them, and most likely torture and execute them. This was a part of English history I had known nothing about until I began researching the novel. And this is the approach to the priest hole at Oxborough. And I know this picture is blurry, but you can see the drop off into the hiding place. And I went down there myself, and I must say it was really terrifying. Ashton Hall is my first novel set entirely in the present, but through Hannah Larson's investigations into the lives of the fictional Cresham family, I wanted to explore how we as individuals go about recreating the past. This question feels very personal to me because it developed from my own experiences researching the history of my family, visiting the town they came from in Europe, finding their names in business directories and old documents, tracing how some of them made their way to America by examining ship manifests on the Ellis Island website. As I researched my family, I began to wonder about what researchers of the future might find if they investigated me. What evidence and clues about me would they have to work from? And I thought, well, first of all, my credit card bills, my checking account statements, my tax returns, my charitable donations showing what I valued. And most importantly, I realized my life would be revealed by lists of the books I've checked out of libraries wherever I've lived. Since childhood, I've been an avid reader, frequently visiting my local libraries. I realized that a comprehensive listing of the books I've borrowed since I first possessed a library card would disclose my hopes, dreams, challenges, probably much more than I'd ever want researchers to know about me. And so when I wrote Ashton Hall, I created first a fictional account ledger for the family in the novel, and I based that on real account ledgers of the Tudor era. The account ledgers I created reveal what the fictional family spent on everything from velvet nightcaps to visiting jugglers and musicians. And in this way, I tried to create a picture of the everyday lives of my characters. And I also created a library for them and a library register to list all the books that they were reading. And I designed that library register to reveal their hopes, their dreams, and their challenges. For some reason, even though the family in the novel is fictional, and so this library is fictional, it was very important to me that the fictional library have actual Tudor era books in it. And this kind of became an obsession of mine that took up many, many months of research, trying to locate actual books that the family might have had in their library. So here's a copy of a book that figures in Ashton Hall. This is a page of a natural history of birds. It's filled with wonderful illustrations. I gave this book to my fictional character, Isabella Cresham, when she was 4 years old, and she loved looking at the pictures. Here's another delightful picture. I love this eagle, and Isabella, my character, loved the eagle too. I also discovered the wonders of hand-illuminated manuscripts. This is a page of the Luttrell Psalter, a book which is very important in the novel. I just love this scene of a woman feeding birds. This is also from the Luttrell Psalter. It's charming snail at the bottom and the men pulling a rowboat. I also discovered medieval pattern books, and I wove them into the novel. Now here's a pattern book that provides 14 different types of alphabets for artists and scribes to copy. And it also provides borders. So I never realized when I would look at an illuminated manuscript that, there were books that taught people how to do this. And of course, they added their own creativity. But I loved the fact that you would get a book that would present the alphabet that you could use and present the decorations that you could use. Because I was researching and writing a good deal of Ashton Hall during the worst months of the COVID-19 lockdown in 2020, I felt drawn to learn about Tudor-era diseases and medical practice. I found out that high percentages of 16th century urban populations died from plague, which was then called pestilence. And in some places in the Tudor era, entire rural villages were abandoned altogether when most of the residents died from plague. And the similarities to our fears in those early days of the pandemic were very strong and very moving to me. In my research, I also learned that women often served their families and their communities as informal physicians, and that they made remedies from herbs. In most cases, herbal remedies were the only medicines people had to treat diseases. So as part of my research, I immersed myself in books about herbal medicine. Now, this is the first index page of the Herbal of John Gerard from 1597. This book figures in Ashton Hall. I was thrilled when I had an opportunity to see one of the early editions at a library in New York City. So John Gerard's Herbal is a really big book, thousands of pages long. You can see here how it's propped up on what's called a book cradle so that the binding doesn't break. And as I was looking through the book, the librarians would very quickly and carefully rearrange this book cradle so that the book was always properly supported. Touching this century-old book, turning the pages, this was a deeply moving experience for me. And this is a very beautiful book. This shows red and white dwarf grass. This shows hollyhocks. I also loved in the book creating a fictional watercolor by John Singer Sargent. Here are my inspirations. So when and if you read the novel, you'll be able to imagine the fictional watercolor yourself. This is Sargent's niece in this watercolor, Rosemary Armand, and she is also figured in my fictional watercolor. Here you see a group of people on a gondola in Venice. And my watercolor shows Rosemary in a gondola. And here's a Venetian canal, just like the one I used. So finally, before we go to questions, I want to tell you about one of the most important characters in the novel, a golden retriever named Duncan. Now, my portrayal of a dog in fiction was inspired by Virginia Woolf's wonderful novel, Flush. And here you see my weather-beaten edition from 1975. Flush is a fictional biography of the poet Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Cocker Spaniel. And every page of this book is a blissful delight. Many people have never heard of this book, even people who are fans of Virginia Woolf. And I highly recommend it, particularly if you love dogs the way I do. Now, these days, I find myself going around my New York City neighborhood looking for a golden retriever who could play Duncan in a movie of Ashton Hall, if ever I'm lucky enough to have a movie made of the novel. Now, this Goldie is very close to my inner imaginings of Duncan, especially with the paw on foot, so tender. Now, this Goldie could also be in the running to play Duncan because you can see how thoughtful this Goldie is and how caring of others and how concerned. I mean, his concern just blossoms from his face. Now, the casting of Duncan has to be done very carefully because Duncan is really a crucial character in the book, and Nicky especially relies on Duncan. The Goldie playing Duncan has to be magnificent, noble, affectionate, and cheerful. Because the truth is, Duncan is based on my own golden retriever, Jasper. I changed the name to Duncan to protect Jasper's privacy in the novel. Now, Jasper died some years ago, but he lives on in our hearts, and probably no Goldie will ever match our own Jasper. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer questions.
So I know that we have some microphones set up. Do you want to describe how that works, or?
So there's a mic on either side. If you have a question, please stand up, walk to the mic. And I no longer would be delighted to answer your question. In the meanwhile,
I have a few questions, so that gives you time to formulate yours or come forward. One of the things you mentioned, Lauren, in your author's notes is that you sketch an outline before you begin writing. And I was wondering what that looks like. If it's like a web, you have so many parts that you weave together. What does that outline look like?
Well, I work pretty much the same way. Have worked pretty much the same way for each of my novels. And I should say first that every writer you talk to is going to have a different answer about the question of outlines. In fact, the idea of outlines is often controversial among fiction writers. So I can only tell you how I like to work. I like to know the end of the novel. I can't begin until I know where the book is going to end. And, you know the opening, and I sketch out, I would call it really a sketch in a yellow legal pad, the characters, details about the characters, but probably not too many details, because I've always found that you learn about the characters as you're writing the book. So I have to give them that freedom, not kind of tie them down from the beginning with too careful descriptions. And then I write some pivotal scenes, always knowing the ending. And then I usually put that outline away, because one of the most exciting and interesting parts of writing a book is the writing of the book and what you discover as you write it. Because a novel, I always think of as a living thing, always changing. And the characters really have to come alive in the book in order for the novel to be compelling. And I think it's my job, in a way, to let those characters come alive, to let them become interested in things that I might not know about or might not be interested in. And just to give a small example, in my second novel, A Fierce Radiance, there's a character of a little boy, and he becomes interested in bird watching. And I didn't know anything about bird watching. And I thought, little boy, maybe you could become interested in something else. But then I realized that that's what made him in a way. And so I made it my business to read some books about bird watching and go to Central Park and do some bird watching so that I could describe that, and little details like that I think bring the characters to life. But you only get that in the process of writing the book. So that's why an outline, is something that I go back and forth on. But I do always need to know the end.
Thank you. So I really appreciate the rich depth of things that you research and build into all of the novels. What drew you to historical fiction as a genre? I know you mentioned the book Catherine. Are there other things that made you want to pursue that genre in particular?
I didn't set out to write historical fiction in particular. I'd always wanted to be a writer from the time I was really little, from the time I was 6 years old. And probably some of you have heard me talk about this, that I don't know why, but from the age of 6, I decided to become a writer. And my first short stories were crayoned stories about heroic dogs and cats. In high school, I was writing poetry, and my wonderful English teachers at the Buffalo Seminary encouraged me to send out my poetry to literary journals, and I collected rejection letters from all the best places around the country. And then I started writing short stories after college. As I said, I sent them out over and over and over, just pushing through the rejections that kept coming. And I was also working on novels early in the morning before I went to work, trying my hand at contemporary novels. And I'd always loved reading historical fiction, but I don't know why it never occurred to me that I could actually write historical fiction. In addition to Catherine by Anna Seton, I was a great fan of Mary Renault's novels about the ancient world. And maybe I felt a little intimidated. I never thought that I could do that. And then one time I was in Buffalo with my son, who was, I think, 4 or 5 years old then. And my mom was babysitting him, and I was just roaming around town for the day. And I happened to wander into the historical museum just up the street here. And they were having an exhibit about the Pan American exposition. And incredibly, when I was growing up in Buffalo, I didn't learn anything about the Pan American Exposition. I didn't know anything about what an extraordinary city this was in 1901. I learned it all at the museum that day. And when I left the museum, I was staggered. And I sat down in Delaware Park. And then suddenly the idea for City of Light came into my mind. I just sort of saw the whole thing before me. And it was at that moment that I thought, I'm going to write historical fiction. So it was really, just getting the idea to write City of Light, and then realizing, well, yes, of course, I should have been trying to do this from the beginning. And that's what really allowed me to move forward as a writer. I also should say that, Ashton Hall is set in the present. And I had thought that writing about the present would turn out to be easier than writing about the past. But that is not true at all. If anything, I was much more anxious writing about things in the present than I ever am when I can research things about the past. Because in the present, you get your character a particular model of cell phone, and she's happy with it. And then 6 months later, a new model comes out, and that's what she wants. And, that kind of thing, it made me very nervous, because I never want readers to say, wait, what kind of cell phone is she using? So it's harder to write. The present is always changing. So for me, it's harder to write about the present when I can at least do research about things in the past and feel a confidence about how things might have been, in my mind at least.
Thank you. So personally, having taught for over 40 years, many children, and having a number of them with that neurodiversity, I really loved that you celebrated those two characters of Nicky and Janet in such a positive way, looking more towards their differences as an asset rather than something to criticize them for. Is there anything more you'd like to add about your choice of those two characters in this book?
I think maybe I should explain first, because I had meant to, what this word is. Neurodivergent is also neurodiversity, neurodiverse. These words are used. You may have heard them, you may not have heard them, because they're recent terms. They are umbrella terms for things like autism, ADD, ADHD, Tourette's. And I like these terms, neurodiverse, neurodivergent, because I don't think it's right to label little kids, oh, you're ADD, oh, you're autism spectrum, because kids are always constantly changing, and no child is just one thing. I mean, I think of the kids that I've known, they all combine different characteristics. And I feel these new words give the freedom to who kids really are. We can see them for who they are. And it was important to me to present these two children in the book, and I hope I did them justice.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. So do you have a question?
Yeah, made it all the way over. Hi.
Hi.
So I loved how you integrated account ledgers and how people spent money back in the days, and library accounts. So I'm wondering, do I have to worry about now somebody looking at the history of all the library books I've taken out over the years in the future? Have you talked to anybody about privacy rights like today with regard to things?
Oh,
like
that's very interesting. In case you didn't hear the question, it's about library registers and privacy rights, and whether I had spoken to anyone about privacy rights today for, this is all digitized now, isn't it? When you go to the library, they just put the barcode under, they know who you are and what you're reading. And, that's something I never really thought about, privacy rights at the library. It's sort of scary when you think about it. It could be the basis for a thriller. Someone finds out what you've been checking out of the library and uses it to blackmail you. Well, I don't know what the situation is, but I think it's filled with potential. So thank you for putting it in my mind.
I also liked that it kind of involved you as a reader, thinking about all those things, the trail that you personally leave. It made me think in a different way. And I liked that. Another question?
Welcome. I had the pleasure of dealing with your mom a lot because I did all of the events for the president. So I know Nancy. She is so much fun. I'm very partial to the last chapter, Catherine, because that's my name, Catherine.
Oh.
But I really love how that chapter really gave some definition to Catherine and the women of that era. But I'm wondering if you can expound upon your research about these women going into these rooms. I've followed, a British Isles history, but I never heard anything like that. So I'm wondering how that came to you and how you decided to use it then.
Thank you. So the question is about anchoresses and how I researched that, put that together, because I guess it's really not well known. And yet, as I say, because I had read Catherine, it was always well known to me. And so when I started researching that, there are, in fact, books written about it. And I found out some disturbing things that, for example, Britain had the highest number of anchoresses of any country in Europe. And they were well-educated upper-class women. And it's so horrifying to us to think of volunteering to be walled in to a cell next to a church to devote yourself to prayer. I mean, even if one is devout, it's a horrible thing to contemplate. But from the best I can tell, at that time, the women who did it, and again, they were well-educated, upper-class women, they felt it was a kind of freedom, a kind of liberation from the striations of the society in which they lived. And don't forget, it was something that was considered very admirable within the culture. And, the bishop would come and bless you as you went into the cell. These people were held up as being extremely virtuous. So there were many reasons people did it. And again, it's very hard to understand, but it was something that has really haunted me. What must a person's life be like? What is your devotion like? And what is your everyday life like? To say that that is a positive step in your life. And that's something I wanted to explore in the book. And I don't want to, give away any spoilers because probably a lot of people here haven't read the book. So that's why I'm not going into a lot of detail about the specific characters in the novel. But it was projecting myself into that role and why women of that time might have found that role to be something valuable to them, to be something fulfilling to them.
I've read two of your books so far, so thank you for writing them.
Thank you.
My question is, during the time period that you were speaking about, when the religion went from Christianity to Protestant Protestant to Catholic and vice versa, were there Jews living among them at the time?
So the question is, during the English Reformation, when the country was the rulers forced the country from under Henry VIII, was Catholic, it's Protestant, then it went back to Catholic, then to Protestant again. Were there Jews living in England at that time? And I think that my husband knows more about this than I do. In fact, they lived there, but secretly, right? So if you didn't, so in case you didn't hear what Michael said, the Jews had been forcibly expelled from England in the 13th century and were not legally let back in until the time of Cromwell. But there were some Jews living there in secrecy, or pretending that they weren't Jewish. And it is said that there were families of musicians, for example, court musicians who were secretly Jews, and perhaps some artists, and maybe medical people, even working at the court, but it was not something that could be acknowledged.
Hello, I find your presentation delightful.
Thank you.
I'm also interested, without revealing too much, of the research you did in neurodivergence.
So the question is about the research that I did in neurodivergence, neurodiversity. Well, I've known a lot of children in my family and in my husband's family who fall under this umbrella. So the place I started was with children I have known, and research I've done over many years because of children I have known. And then for the book, I did, more research to make sure I knew the latest writings about this, what researchers have to say, what doctors have to say. But it's a very personal part of the novel, and it is certainly based on children who I have known in my family and in my husband's family. Mm-hmm. Oh, thank you. That's very kind of you to say. It's a very important part of the novel for me. Yes. Oh, you can just stand up and speak loudly. I'll repeat the question. So the question is, what am I working on now? And I appreciate you asking. I'm a very superstitious person. And so I never talk about my work in progress. But one thing I realized recently is that my hesitation isn't simply superstition. It's also a feeling that if I start talking about the work while it's still evolving, while the characters are still taking on life, I kind of imprison them down a particular path or road so that they're locked in stone before they're really fully themselves. And it's very important to me that they always have their freedom. That if I start saying, oh, I'm writing a novel about X, it's like I'm forcing them to go down Elmwood Avenue when really maybe they should be going down Delaware Avenue. So I don't ever want to force them into one road. I want to give them their freedom till the book is done. So that's the real reason. Yes.
Really describe that. It's like,
Wait, I have a question for you. She says that the minute she started reading the book, she knew it was Blickling. How did you know it was Blickling? Well, yes, the moat. But that's not the only house with a dried out moat. Well, it's one that has all those flowers of all the ones you've been to. Oh, well, that's interesting. Well, because it's basically Blickling. Yeah. Okay, go on.
Manuscript of that building basically like a church with the woman in it. So I understand that there were numerous people in that situation, but did you find in your research whether there were actually any women evolved into England's great poems, or was that something out of your imagination?
Well, it was out of my imagination, but I think that it's plausible. And when I started reading more about the priest holes, and that, in that era when Catholic priests had to hide from the government troops, some of the hiding places did not have oxygen supplies, and priests would die there, and their bodies be discovered years later sometimes, if the family was arrested and taken away. And there were many, but not many, there have been cases of the bodies of priests found in these hiding holes because they couldn't get out. The family would have to release them. And if the family was arrested and taken away and executed, there was no, the whole point of the priest holes was that no one could find them. And yes. At Oxbow, because that's one of their big tourist things, is that they have Oxburgh, Oxbow Hall. And it's a weird thing. They advertise it now, come see the priest hole, and they want kids to look at it. And I think it's a thing for kids. I found it to be pretty terrifying when I went down in that priest hole, because they close the door on you. They did not close the door on me, but you could see if they did, where's the oxygen supply? And you're in absolute darkness. So it was really frightening. Anything else? You don't have to get up and come to the mic. So just speak loudly. Okay. Well, Michael and I lived in England in 2012, which is 11 years ago, and they were very much in existence then. And then we met someone else who had one, and she told me this very crucial piece of information, that if you cook a lot of meat, you should pour 2 kettles of boiling water into the drain every day. And when she told me that, I decided I would never cook meat in the cottage, because the thought of that, because you look in the water and you see your toothpaste and your oatmeal, everything, soap suds. And I didn't want to have it be greasy from cooking meat. Important details. Yeah. So, whether they've all been filled in now, 10 years later, I just don't know. But I think it was not uncommon in 2012, obviously not in a big city, but it's this makeshift plumbing for houses that were built centuries ago without plumbing. This is what they wound up doing. This was their solution to the problem of not having plumbing. Yes. Yeah, so there's one scene in the book where the shower catches fire and starts pouring black smoke along with the water. Now, that actually happened to me while I was taking a shower. And, I'm washing my hair. I think, oh, I smell smoke. I wonder where it's coming from. And then the room was filled with smoke. And I thought, where is the smoke coming from? And I saw it pouring out of the shower head with the water. So what to do? I screamed. Michael came in. He was taken aback also. We turned the shower off. And when we turned the shower off, the smoke stopped pouring out. But it was still, or did it keep pouring out? I'm not sure. Anyway, we called the landlady who lived in the big house next door. And she she just could not believe these stupid Americans, the things that they didn't understand, like the French drain so she came over and she said, well, you have to turn off the electricity to the shower. And where was that? In the kitchen, at the very high near the ceiling of the kitchen. And she turned that off. And it was at that point that the smoke stopped. And come to find out, in England, they use electric showers to boost the water pressure, because otherwise you wouldn't have adequate pressure to take a shower. And sometimes, therefore, the electrical box that serves the shower can have a short circuit. And that short circuit causes black smoke to come pouring out. So it was very educational to live in England. Well, yes, the British are very nonchalant about these things because this is what happens. Right. A joy. Well, Julian of Norwich, the question again is about anchoresses. And Julian of Norwich was a real woman, anchoress and mystic. And she is the anchoress who features in the novel Catherine. And a very big chunk of the novel Catherine is made up of interactions with Julian of Norwich, who wrote mystical writings and was quite famous in her time for her writings. And she's still famous. And they're spiritual writings. So she was very devout. And yes, there was a joy, the joy of religious devotion. Yeah, a window, you would talk. And many of the women also had a servant, a paid servant, because they were from wealthy families. And the servant would bring food, push the food through the window, take away the waste, because again, no plumbing. It's a very unusual, it's very hard to wrap our minds around it today, I think. But I think for the women who did it, there was a kind of freedom, a kind of joy, a kind of fulfillment. Well, that's what I tried to think a lot about anchoresses in the novel. Again, I don't want to speak too specifically because I know a lot of people haven't read the book, but it was something that I felt drawn to explore in the book. Anything else?
Well, I'd like to personally thank you for sharing all the wonderful things that go into the writing of your books. And I look forward to the next installment.
Oh, thank you. Well, thank you all so much. You've been a great audience.
Lauren has graciously agreed to sign your book. You have to bring it with you. If you do so kind as to enter the stage from that end. She's going to stay seated right where she is. She's having to sign your book. She's already got it. Laura.
Right.
I'm sure. Again, again, I really want to thank you, and I just want to invite you back. We meet every first Thursday of the month. It's on our website. This is some wonderful familiar faces that I haven't seen in a little while, so I'm really delighted that you came this evening and really invite you to come back. Occasionally, in 2 weeks, we had a book launch. Someone who's just published a book. It's speaking, it's still something exciting to do, and that will happen in the third year student about. So please watch out for our book club on the Virtual Arts on the website. And again, Lauren and Laura, thank you both for this a wonderful evening. Thank you so much.
And thank you all for being here.
Thank you.